Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The next non constitutional body that we will learn about in this unit is the Disaster Management Authority. Disasters can be of different types, right? There can be natural disasters such as tsunamis, earthquakes, floods. Disasters can also be man made, such as the Bhopal gas leak tragedy, which was a man made disaster. It was not a natural disaster. Recently, the world has been increasingly facing several disasters, and most of them are caused by climate change. For example, USA has been witnessing a lot of massive, widespread forest fires in the recent years. In India, several states were faced with floods in 2018. Kerala and parts of Karnataka was faced with flood. Very recently, Delhi was faced with a very bad flood situation. In Turkey and parts of Syria, there was a huge, massive earthquake that happened in 2023, which claimed the life of over 58,000 people. So, yes, the world in general is changing a lot because of climate change, and climate change is also causing a lot of natural disasters. So, whenever a disaster happens, firstly, we need to prevent these kind of disasters, right? Be it man made, be it natural, we should always strive to prevent these kind of disasters. Secondly, there need to be some level of preparedness. If at all a disaster is to happen, we need to be prepared to face that disaster as an individual, as a part of the community, as a part of the state or the nation. There need to be some level of preparedness, and we need to be resilient. As a nation, we need to be resilient towards disaster. So that's why we have a disaster management authority. However, this authority only came into existence from 2005. What all happened before that? So the decade of 1990s was declared by the UN as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. Following this, in 1999, a high-powered committee was constituted to look into the disaster management aspects in the country. In 2001, the Gujarat earthquake happened, which was once again an earthquake that happened on a large scale, which claimed the lives of many, many people. Following this, a national committee was constituted, which was to look into improving preparedness when it comes to disasters, which was to suggest effective mitigation mechanisms for disaster management. It also was to suggest a disaster management plan. All of this was done by the committee. However, no action was taken place after the committee's report. Please note that in the Constitution, in the seventh schedule, which talks about the union list, state list, and the concurrent list, there is no mention of disaster management. There can be some entries which you can interpret as yes, this is a part of disaster management. However, there is no explicit entry as disaster management in the schedule. So in 2002, there was another commission which was headed by Venkatachalaya, which was a national commission to review the working of the constitution. So they looked into the dire state of disaster management in India, and they said that the mechanism for immediate state responses to emergencies and disasters is wholly inadequate in India. And there was a suggestion prior to this commission by the Ministry of Agriculture, which suggested that a new entry shall be added to list 3, concurrent list, which will be management of disaster and emergencies, natural or man made. Even the Venkatachalya Commission agreed with this suggestion. However, we do not have an entry on disaster management even now. So, in 2004, another natural disaster happened, which was again a widespread, large scale disaster, which was the Indian Ocean tsunami. Following this, the National Disaster Management Act was enacted, and In this act, it was mentioned that a National Disaster Management Authority shall be established. So, in 2005, by way of an executive order, a National Disaster Management Authority was instituted, which means initially it was an executive body, even though the statute was talking about its establishment. In 2006, finally, it was notified as a statutory body. So, this statutory body, National Disaster Management Authority, is responsible for bringing together all of the stakeholders whenever there is a disaster in order to prevent disaster, to build preparedness, to be more resilient. So stakeholders can be, the victims of the disaster. It can be the government. It can be other authorities. It can even be the it can even be the disaster management authority. So all of this, they bring together all of these in the face of a disaster. So, the National Disaster Management Authority, or NDM, is the topmost body for disaster management in India. It works under the Union Ministry of Home Affairs. Speaking of its composition, the Prime Minister will be the ex officio chairperson of NDMA, and there will be other members, 9 members in total, who will be nominated by the Prime Minister, and he will also designate one of them as the vice chairperson of NDMA, who will be responsible for the day to day functioning of the authority. What are the main objectives of this particular authority? So, firstly, to prevent disasters, increase preparedness, and be more resilient towards disasters. So, essentially, making India more resilient and safe in the face of disasters. And how do we do that? Through education, through knowledge, and through technology. So, it's a combined effort. There is never one single entity that is responsible for disaster management. Actually, it's a combined effort. However, we have this authority to guide us, to supervise, or to monitor all of these activities. So, all of these efforts to prevent disasters, to be more prepared, and to be resilient, they'll have to be done in a sustainable way. So, we talked about the Planning Commission, wherein we talked about economic and social development, right? So, development is essential for the progress of a country, no doubt. However, development will also have to be done in a sustainable manner. So, sustainable manner keeps in mind the environment as well. So there can be no development which forgets environment. In that case, that is an invitation for more disasters. So we need to conduct our development of nation in a way that we are not exhausting all of the resources that are available to us. We are also keeping in mind the future generations that will come, so we will keep a part of the resources for them as well. So this is what sustainable development is. Whatever developmental activities are there, they'll have to firstly keep in mind the environment. Secondly, they'll also have to keep in mind the disaster resilience aspect. If that is not done, then more disasters are bound to happen, and they will happen in a larger scale, in a scale that is much more larger than what would have happened had there been proper disaster management planning that went before these developmental activities had taken place. So, this particular objective will have to be carried out keeping in mind the environmental sustainability using technology, knowledge, education. Traditional wisdom can also be used for carrying out or materializing this particular objective. Second objective is similar, but in other words, which is to mainstream disaster management into developmental planning process. So, whatever developmental planning is carried out in the country, it has to be infused with disaster management. Speaking of this, it is not just the Disaster Management Act that is there for managing disasters. Even other legislations, even though they may not look like a disaster management legislation, can be used for this purpose. For example, Chapter 14 of Indian Penal Code talks about offences against public safety and health, which can be used for preventing certain disasters. Water Act, Air Act, all of these are there to prevent water pollution and air pollution, respectively. They can also be considered as a component of disaster management. There are several building safety standards and other industrial safety standards which are there to prevent industrial disasters and disasters relating to buildings. You can even say that motor vehicle accidents is a legislation to prevent disasters. And building safety, when it comes to development, Be it development about it can be developing a metro system, it can be construction of bridges, construction of any other kind of buildings. All of this, following safety standards is essentially important. If those are not followed, then that can lead to a lot of man-made disasters as well. And in face of natural disasters, these buildings or constructional activities will suffer a lot. For example, in UK in 2017, there was a Grenfell Tower that was caught in fire. The fire actually started in one of the apartments in their fridge. It was not supposed to cause a disaster of this huge scale. However, because the building was constructed flouting many building safety standards, the cladding, the outer part of the building, was constructed using a material that actually escalated the fire instead of reducing it. So there were a lot of safety standard failure that were there in the Grenfell Towers, which led to the escalation of fire to a great extent and which claimed the lives of many people. So, yes, this is precisely the reason why we need to follow this kind of safety standards, industrial standards, building standards, all of that. The third objective is to develop forecasting and early warning system, which also has a fail-safe communication component. So you get your weather forecast in your phones, or you might see weather forecast in news channels, right? Similarly, they also forecast if there is heavy rainfall, which might lead to floods. So all of these early warnings, as much as possible, shall be given to the general public, once again to reduce the scale of disasters. So it is the objective of the National Disaster Management Authority to develop such kind of forecasting and early warning system, which also has a fail-safe communication component. The next objective of Disaster Management Authority is to develop a techno-legal framework for regulating and for ensuring compliance with respect to all of these matters, for the identification, assessing, and monitoring of disaster risk. Next objective is to ensure efficient response, especially for the vulnerable section of the society. See, whenever there is a disaster, it is always the most vulnerable section of the society that is vulnerable to disasters as well. Vulnerable section as in underprivileged people, those who come from lower income families, those who are coming from the minority communities. They are always more vulnerable in the face of a disaster as well. So there need to be efficient response, on the ground response, and specifically, especially for these vulnerable groups as well. The next objective is to undertake reconstruction activities after a disaster has happened, and this reconstruction activity will have to be disaster resilient. It is also the objective of the Disaster Management Authority to enter into proactive and productive partnership with the media. Whenever there is a disaster, media helps to amplify the voice of the victims of the disaster so that the elected representatives of the area, the bureaucrats, and the uh, it is also the objective of the Disaster Management Authority to enter into productive and proactive partnership with the media. Media plays a huge role in amplifying the voices of the victims whenever there is a disaster, so that they'll reach the ears of the elected representatives of the area or other politicians or influential people or bureaucrats in that area, so that proper and timely action can be taken place. Yes, media in sometimes also exaggerates information. However, it is an important tool. The authority is also responsible for approving the national plan. So we need a national plan uh, which will detail out the disaster management for the nation. It will recommend minimum relief for the disaster victims. It also exercises superintendence over National Disaster Relief Response Force. So NDRF is also mentioned under the Act. The National Disaster Management Authority exercises superintendence over NDRF. Speaking of the functions of National Disaster Management Authority, it approves the National Plan for Disaster Management. It also approves plans prepared by different ministries and their departments. It lays down guidelines that has to be followed by different state disaster management authorities while they are formulating plans for their respective states. It is also responsible for coordinating and the enforcement and implementation of the policy and disaster management plans. It is also the function of the National Disaster Management Authority to recommend provision of funds for mitigation mechanisms. It also extends support to other countries if they are faced with a disaster and if the central government has the authority to do so. It also undertakes several activities for capacity building. So, as mentioned before, there is a state disaster management authority in every state, which will be chaired by the chief minister of that state. And the chairperson of the state executive committee will be the ex officio chief executive officer of the state disaster management authority. In case you're confused, the state executive committee is also envisaged under the Disaster Management Act. This particular body, this particular committee is responsible for implementing disaster management plans. So it is essentially the coordinating and managing body. So the chairperson of this particular committee will be the ex officio chief executive officer of State Disaster Management Authority. There will be other 8 members who will be nominated by the chair of the authority, and one of them will be designated as the vice chairperson who will be responsible for the day to day functioning of the State Disaster Management Authority. Functions like the National Disaster Management Authority, they are supposed to lay down a state disaster management plan or policy, and they will approve plans, disaster management plans made by different ministries and departments of the state government. There is also a district disaster management authority or DDMA in every district of each state, and that will be headed either by the district collector or the district magistrate or deputy commissioner. These are the officials who can be appointed as the chairperson of a district disaster management authority. To give an example of a success story of disaster management in one of the Indian states, we can talk about Odisha. State of Odisha is in the eastern side of India and also is vulnerable to cyclones and other natural disasters because of its unique positioning. So in 2019, there was a cyclone, a very peculiar cyclone, which was named Cyclone Fani, which had a recorded speed of 240 kilometers per hour. However, in Odisha, there is a robust disaster management mechanism. They also enter into partnership with International Organization for Disaster Management. And because of the efficient and timely response to this particular cyclone, it was very well managed. The number of fatalities was very low. So, yes, Odisha is a success story when it comes to disaster management in India. But not all states or even the situation of national planning of disaster is as successful as has been in the case of Odisha. Even though the Act was enacted in 2005 and the National Disaster Management Authority came into existence in 2005, the first National Disaster Management Plan was only formulated in 2016, over 10 years, over a decade after the enactment of the Act and the establishment of the National Disaster Management Authority. That in itself shows that how far behind we are when it comes to disaster. There is also a growing allegation that there is lack of coordination, there is inadequate training given to the responders, the first responders in whenever there is a disaster. And it remains one of the biggest challenges to proper disaster management. For example, when the Kerala floods happened in 2018, this was a major allegation that there was no proper coordination among different disaster management authorities, different levels of disaster management authorities. However, during the Kerala floods, there was a great deal of community resilience. The community came together for disaster management, and that is a great example of community resilience. In 2019, the disaster management plan introduced biological and public health emergency. So we know that COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc across the world and in India also. So Disaster Management Act was frequently used during the pandemic, and several directions and guidelines were issued by the central government using the disaster management plan. So yes, that's all about disaster management in our country, and the non-constitutional body, which is the National Disaster Management Authority, and the state and the district bodies, which are responsible for effective and proper disaster management. However, in theory, these are all effective and proper. In practice, we see that there is still a lot that we need to figure out and fix in terms of disaster management. So the last non-constitutional body that we will learn about in this unit is the Reserve Bank of India. Over to that.